Today's story is a Vikram-Betaal one, featuring a tricky situation, a love triangle, a ruthless bandit, and a puzzle as usual. Will Vikramaditya solve it this time? Let's find out. Welcome to Stories from India. This is a podcast that will take you on a journey through the rich mythology, folklore, and history of the Indian subcontinent. I am Narad Muni, the celestial storyteller and the original Time Lord. With my ability to travel through space and time, I can bring you fascinating stories from the past, the present, and the future. From the epic tales of the Mahabharata and Ramayana to the folk tales of the Panchatantra, to stories of Akbar Birbal and Tenali Raman. I have a story for every occasion. The purpose of the stories is neither to pass judgment nor to indoctrinate. My goal is only to share these stories with people who may not have heard them before, and to make them more entertaining for those who have. In this episode, we are back into the world of Vikram and Betaal. We have covered several Vikram and Betaal stories on this show, and we have also covered some of the Singhasan Battisi, which has a similar structure. You can find the links to all of these in the show notes. If you haven't heard any of the previous Vikram-Betaal stories, that is totally fine, because these stories are standalone. The only context you need is that of the framing narrative. I'll give you a quick summary of that right now. Raja Vikramaditya, or Vik as I shall call him, was a well-known and well-respected king. His people appreciated him by giving him gifts, on top of the taxes that they already paid. One of those gift givers was a rishi, or a wise man. This rishi gave Vik a mango every day. Vik didn't really think much of it until one day he accidentally discovered that each of those mangoes contained a massive and valuable gem inside. Naturally, Vik felt obligated to pay the rishi back for exponentially increasing the kingdom's wealth. That's exactly what the rishi wanted. He explained to Vik that he needed the king's help to complete a very special prayer. The only missing ingredient was a Betaal. In case you haven't heard the term before, a Betaal is a reanimated corpse. Some early members of the British Raj incorrectly and clumsily equated Betaals with vampires. You might say that the term zombie is a lot closer, except that Betaals could also talk lucidly, and they could fly. They didn't need sustenance, brains or otherwise. Betaals mostly were in the habit of hanging out in peepal trees, by hanging down from them, like bats. The rishi wanted Vik to go Betaal shopping in the cemetery, which had several peepal trees, and each of those trees had several Betaals ripe for the plucking. The rishi did not explain why, but Vik had to go fetch the Betaal strictly in the middle of the night, and he had to go all alone. Well, Vik hadn't become king by being a coward, so he accepted the rishi's conditions. Vik climbed the tree and grabbed the Betaal easily enough. When he was making his way back to the rishi, the Betaal told him a story. It was a story that had a question in the end. A question that Vik could not resist answering. The only problem was that when Vik opened his mouth to speak, The Betaal was able to escape and fly away. This happened over and over. It may seem like Vic wasn't learning from experience and wasn't keeping his mouth shut. But it wasn't just him. The Betaal wasn't learning either because he kept going back to exactly the same spot as before. This happened 25 times. The Betaal told him 25 stories and always with the same outcome. Except for the 25th story, but we are not there yet. We have covered many of these stories before. This story begins the same way as the others, with Vic walking across the cemetery with the Betaal on his back. The Betaal launched straight away into the story. They were both used to the routine by now. There was no need for any icebreakers. There was a kingdom once, the Betaal began. There always is, Vic thought to himself. Not surprising. Considering the century we live in, there aren't any other established forms of government. But Vic was careful not to say anything out loud. Otherwise, the Betaal would just escape again. In this kingdom, there was a man, the Betaal continued. Let's call him Somdat. Somdat was in his family business, which was to sell groceries in town. They owned and managed Kirana Bazaar and deliveries. Perhaps, Vic, you've seen some of their posters? The colorful ones that say, groceries dashed to your door? Vic had indeed seen one of those posters inside his own palace. Being the king, he obviously didn't need to worry about mundane things like groceries. But the Kirana Bazaar sales rep had talked him into it. The palace got a lot of foot traffic, so it was the perfect advertising place, the smooth-talking salesman had said. The Betaal tapped Vic on the shoulder. It seemed to him that the king was meandering off into a tangent. Could he please pay attention to the Betaal story here? Anyway, Somdat was well-to-do, obviously. His riches meant he was in want of nothing. In fact, the only thing he didn't have was companionship. He was in his early 20s and he had not yet married. This was surprising only because he lived in an era where, at his age, people were expected to have a well-established family. And the larger the family, the greater the amount of respect a person got. If Somdat had cornered any of his former schoolmates and rattled off the list of his achievements, his building, property, bank balance, bangla, gaadi, maa, and asked them, "Kya hai tumhare paas?" Any of those former school chums would have simply answered, "Mere paas biwi hai," meaning, I have a wife. But remember the golden rule. The one who has the gold can break all the rules. So Somdat got a little coaching and got right back into the search for a wife. And right away, he found the perfect candidate. She was one of his customers at their flagship store. And at least on Somdat's part, it was love at first sight. He found out who she was. Her name was Chandrasena, and she was a librarian. The next step was obviously to express his feelings. So he wrote her a letter. It goes to show how much he was immersed in his profession that the letter went something like this. Dear Chandrasena, I am nuts about you. You're one in a melon, and the apple of my eye. You've Gotta pizza my heart. If you were a vegetable, you'd be a cucumber. I love you very much, from my head to my toes. Don't you think you and I will make the perfect pair? My heart will always beat for you. Fruitfully yours, Somdat. Chandrasena's response was a lot quicker than Somdat expected. She was a librarian, and yet she wasn't following her own library's strict 2-week return policy. Dear Somdat, do we belong together? Oh, how I wish we did. But I'm already overbooked and out of circulation. I was bound to be checked out. I'm engaged to Jaikarna. He came into my library one day and asked me if I had any books on wedding proposals. And I said yes. My head tells me not to overdo it and to simply turn the page on this chapter. But I just can't help myself. I'm going to follow my heart and come to you tonight. I'll just have to do it in a way that doesn't cause panic here. Bye now. I have to go to the altar. The Pandit and Jaikarna and all the wedding guests are waiting for me down there. I can't simply put them on hold. Please keep quiet about us. Bookishly yours, Chandrasena. P.S. You have 2 overdue books that you should return immediately to avoid a fine. Somdat wasn't sure if she was joking. Not about the overdue books. He knew that part was right. He did have 2 overdue books. But he wasn't sure if she was joking about getting married. He had never known a librarian to joke about anything, so the odds were against. And his instincts were spot on. Somdat found out later that day, when, as a guest at a wedding, he discovered with a shock that it was Chandrasena and Jaikarna's. The grocer observed that the wedding was okay, but it was the reception that really took the cake. It was an emotional moment for Somdat, and not because the cake was in tears. The father of the bride proposed a toast to the lovely bride and groom, for better or worse. For better or worse. Later that evening, the newlyweds were finally alone together. Chandrasena told Jaikarna that she had something very important to tell him. Then she proceeded to spill the beans. Why did you spill these beans? Her husband asked. Here, help me pick them up. While helping him pick up the literal, physical beans she had spilled, Chandrasena explained that her heart was already checked out to Somdat. There were many different ways Jaikarna could have reacted. Chandrasena seemed to be getting cold feet. Her feet were certainly cooler than room temperature. Jaikarna was numb. He merely told her that she should go be with Somdat instead. Chandrasen was so delighted to hear these words that she didn't stop to think if Jaikarna meant it sarcastically. She dashed off right away, still in her full wedding clothes and jewelry. Well, on the dark deserted highway from Jaikarna's home to Somdat's, there was a highwayman, a thief, a robber, a bandit, whatever you want to call him. You could also call him Gabbar Singh, because that was his name. Chandrasena's jewelry shone like a beacon in the moonlight, like a neon light sign advertising to all highwaymen to come grab all this jewelry. Gabbar Singh was suspicious for a second. This was too easy. Was Chandrasena actually an undercover policewoman ready to arrest him? He dismissed the thought almost immediately. His patriarchal mind could not fathom that women could have any profession other than homemaker. He stopped her and said, "बहुत चमक है तेरे गहनों में। ये गहने हमको दे दे लड़की." Meaning, your jewelry is very shiny. Could you please give it to Gabbar Singh? Please? Only, he didn't say please, and he didn't phrase it as a question. Just in case she didn't speak Bollywood, Gabbar Singh added, "Give me all your jewelry or your geography." Chandrasena was puzzled. "Don't you mean history?" "Don't try to change the subject," the robber said. Chandrasena pleaded with Gabbar Singh. She had to rush to Somdat's house before Jaikarna changed his mind. This was no time for her to slowly take off each of the articles of jewelry. Please, could she keep them for just an hour? She had to check in at Somdat's house ASAP, but she would return. If Gabbar had a book deposit box, she would happily drop off her jewelry there. Gabbar Singh gave in, without too much of a fight. But first, he made her swear that the jewelry was his now. It was on loan to her just for the next hour. Chandrasena rushed to Somdat's house and burst in through the front door. But she was disappointed. Somdat had had some time to think. Now he was very nervous about accepting her presence in his home and in his life. "I can't elope," he said. "If she hadn't been married, it would have been okay. And if Jaikarna wasn't one of his largest investors, it would have been even better. No, he couldn't risk offending Jaikarna, and certainly not offending the entire village, who would go to his competitors instead. Chandrasena must return to her husband. But hey, he could give her those 2 overdue books, just like she asked in her letter, so maybe she could consider that a win." Chandrasena was heartbroken. It is to her credit that she did not do Somdat an injury. She did call him several names, which I will not repeat here, other than to say that the adjectives she used included unprintable and plagiaristic. Chandrasena headed back towards Jaikarna's home. If she reconciled with him, everything might be okay. Maybe no one would even notice that she had been away, other than Jaikarna, of course. And she would be able to convince him, so she thought. But before she got there, she met Gabbar Singh. He was in the same spot as before, and he seemed genuinely surprised that she had returned. While she was slowly taking off each of her bangles one by one, they got to talking. Gabbar heard her story, and it was obvious that he was emotionally affected by it. "Are those tears, Gabbar?" she asked him. "No," he quickly said, choking off a sob. "Just a little dust in my eyes. I'm not crying, you're crying. I don't want your jewelry. It's worthless to me. I can't even be bothered to trash it. You take it away from here." With that, he ran away, presumably to call it a night. Chandrasena took all her jewelry, and returned to Jaikarna. Her husband could clearly see that his wife's meeting with Somdat had not gone well. She tried to dismiss everything. Look, you said some things, I said some things. Let's just forget it all. We'll close that chapter and move on, okay? It's just water under the bridge now. Jaikarna refused. No, we jolly well won't move on, he told her. Chandrasena asked him what about his pledge to stick together in sickness and in health and so on. Jaikarna reminded her where exactly his pledges had gone the moment she walked out on him. Since Somdat already had her heart, he was welcome to the rest of her as well. So there was Chandrasena, without a path forward. The Betaal concluded. That's the story, Vic. I'm wondering whose actions were morally correct here. Was it Somdat? Because he did the correct thing by refusing to marry Chandrasena. After all, the only time he was expressing his feelings for her, he didn't know she was about to be married. Or was it Jaikarna who was doing the correct thing? He discarded his own feelings. He honored his wife's wish, even though she wanted to ditch him. And then he stuck to his principles by refusing to be her rebound. Or was it Chandrasena? Because she did everything according to her heart, though she might have just been a victim of unfortunate timing. Vic thought for a moment and said that it was possible to make a case for any of the three. That is, if the Betaal twisted himself into a pretzel, which seemed entirely possible, though tricky, given he was so darned slippery. Neither Somdat's nor Jaikarna's egos were comfortable with the idea of a second-hand Chandrasena. Chandrasena was naive, but rather foolish. The one who had acted most honorably was in fact Gabbar Singh. He was a villain in general, but never could it be said that he didn't treat Chandrasena honorably. He let her go without harming her, and he let her keep her jewelry. We need more Gabbar Singhs in India, Vic concluded. The Betaal warned Vic to be careful what he wished for. More importantly, the Betaal added, Vic, you've been speaking all this while. So, ta-ta. The Betaal was back in the air and headed back to the tree. Vic sighed and turned around and went back towards the peepal tree. That's it for this time. A few notes. Previous Vikram-Betaal stories are linked in the show notes and on the site sfipodcast.com. There's also the Singhasan Battisi series, which we have covered before. It's related to this one in the sense that there is a similar framing narrative and a sequence of stories told to a king. King Bhoj, who wanted to sit on the throne, heard stories from each of the 32 statues on the throne. The other connection there is that the throne belonged to Vikramaditya. It was a gift from Indra, the chief of the Devs and ruler of Swarg. Previous Singhasan Battisi episodes are also linked in the show notes and on the site. Check them out as well. In the next episode, we'll talk about Kartikeya. Many of you wanted to hear stories about this son of Shiva and Parvati, and so that's exactly what we are going to do. Thank you all for the comments on social media and on Spotify's Q&A. I can't directly reply to the questions there, but I'll address them here on this show. Devilskin, great to hear that you're still listening and loving these stories. Thank you for the feedback. Rez, I was so thrilled to read your comment. Thank you for all your support and please keep the feedback coming. Prasanna, thank you for your comment as well. Tal, thank you for your support. By making episodes more recent, do you mean picking stories from things that have recently been in the news? If so, that clashes a little bit with my principles as a time traveler. I'd prefer to keep my stories far in the past or far in the future. I have done some stories that are closer to our time, particularly those from history. But if I told stories from last week or last year, I'd risk interfering with the present, and the consequences to that can be rather catastrophic. Hiranmai, as always, thank you for your wonderful support. I absolutely loved your suggestion about merchandise. I'll throw this out to all of you listeners out there. Would you folks be interested in Stories from India merchandise? T-shirts, caps, notebooks, keyrings and such? Tell me what you think. If there's interest, I'd love to set this up. Twerfer, Chandrakanta is going to come up pretty soon. A few other people have requested Chandrakanta as well. Arvind Acharya, thank you for the suggestion. I've added Subhash Chandra Bose to my backlog. Mushroom? Certainly. There are some interesting folk tales from Karnataka that I can add to my ever-growing backlog. If you have any other comments or suggestions, or if there are particular stories that you'd like to hear, please do let me know by leaving a comment or a review on the site sfipodcast.com or reply to the questions on Spotify's Q&A. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get notified automatically of new episodes. A big thank you to each and every one of you for your continued support and your feedback. The music is from purpleplanet.com. That's purple-planet.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.